Back in the ancient times of the early 2000s when I was in middle school, one of the first PC games I ever sunk my teeth into was Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction. I used to spend hours doing Baal and Mephisto runs just to do PvP, which mind you was unbalanced as hell. Anyway, I've seen people say that Diablo 1 has a better atmosphere than Diablo 2, and this is where Tower of Kalemonvo comes in. This game is a hardcore isometric action RPG with randomly generated levels meant for fans of slower paced action games. It's a sort of retro modern blend that has a niche appeal, and it's made by a solo developer that knows their audience. The core of the gameplay mechanics revolve around your typical ARPG experience with a few minor tweaks sprinkled in. When starting a new game, you can choose your gender, but it has zero impact on your actual gameplay. Similarly, you can choose from a few different starting weapons, but that doesn't really matter since this game has a classless system. And leveling progression is primarily stat driven, so this means that all weapons, spells, and combat arts are available to everyone, you just need to meet the minimum requirements to wield them. True to its inspiration, there's also no respec, so you have to commit to your stat allocation. Although it's classless, the different gear in the game does point to the 3 different archetypal classes: warrior, wizard, and rogue. The combat arts, which are the non-spell abilities in this game, are tied to the weapon type, which means there's no skill tree to invest in. For example, two-handed weapons are the only weapon type that have the ability weapon throw, which you throw in a straight line and then it comes back like a boomerang, while bows have an ability called piercing shot, which, you guessed it, pierces through enemies. The magic system is also a direct parallel to Diablo 1, meaning you can only obtain new spells if you find the spellbook and you meet the minimum intelligence requirements to use it. The combat itself is obviously in the style of Diablo 1, slow and methodical. This is in contrast to the modern ARPG style of the screen clearing gotta go fast at all times mindless gameplay variety, ironically popularized by Blizzard themselves. In the spirit of the original Diablo, you also assign the spells to the F keys, and the combat arts work the same way, in which you press any one of the QWERTY keys and then you press the right click to activate that skill as well. If you wanted to, there's an option in the settings where you can activate the quick cast, meaning that when you press the hotkey, it just activates the skill right from pressing that key. There are a few quirks to consider when jumping into this game though. This first one is a little neutral to me, as it involves the number of spells, combat arts, and how they relate to the efficiency of mana recovery or lack thereof. On one hand, I understand the developer wants to stay true to their creative vision and the spirit of being deliberate with your abilities, but on the other hand, especially in the early game, a skill's impact doesn't really justify their mana usage. And because you're so squishy, you have to do a lot of kiting. I mean a lot of kiting, which you could argue is a staple of the genre, but when you have to do it for even trash mobs, it does get a little tedious. Hit registration is also a little wonky, and I know there's an attack rating stat, but it feels like it's a separate issue from that. It seems to be more noticeable whenever you attack an enemy in a doorway or near corners. Another thing is that enemies don't respawn, so there's no grinding for XP or gear drops. Which leads me to a not so neutral consideration, and it's that the itemization in RNG can be a little bit too punishing. There are sparsely placed vendors that you can buy new loot to replace your old loot with, but in my experience in my first successful run, I only replaced a piece of gear maybe a couple of times at most. There is a way to repurpose junk loot, but I only knew about how to use it through another Steam review. Something else I noticed is that enemy scaling is slightly inconsistent, especially as it relates to elite enemies and the mobs that accompany them. For some reason, if you try to be clever and lure 1 or 2 at a time away, no matter how far away that sucker is from the group, they'll always aggro the entire mob. In my experience, I started with the bow because the ranger and any type of ARPG is my jam, but very quickly found it pretty hard to scale my damage and survivability, so I started over with another character and opted for a wizard build instead, and basically had the same issues as I did with my ranger build, which led me to trying for a two-handed melee warrior, and is where I found most of my success, relying on reckless charge when I needed to close the distance or weapon throw whenever they lined up like idiots so I could knock them all down. But most of the time I was relying on the basic attack, especially as I moved up in floors, as the ability stopped scaling well in terms of damage. In saying all that, it might sound like I had a negative experience with the game, but I genuinely enjoy my time playing this. I just feel like there needs to be some minor adjustments and tweaks to make this game truly feel special, especially since I enjoy almost everything else this game has to offer. That said, on a Steam news post, the developer did say they have some balance changes on the way, so I'm kind of excited for that. While I do love the narrative and storytelling for Diablo 1, Diablo 2, and some of Diablo 4, we don't talk about 3, I understand they're also not the most complex or compelling. Tower of Kalemonvo's story is similar in that regard. Basically, Basically, your goal is to climb this tower that once belonged to a powerful wizard by the name of Kalemonvo. The ultimate goal is to prevent a bunch of weirdo cultists from getting their hands on Kalemonvo's orb of power so that they don't use it to cause hellishly heinous harm. There is a lore book that contains an introduction that gives you slightly more detail about the context, as well as a bestiary that gives you more details about the monsters you fight, both accessible from the main menu, but the rest of the story is drip fed to you through sparse interactions with the NPCs you meet. As it stands, it's mostly serviceable as a vehicle to move the rest of the game along, which is totally fine. I'm not mad at it, but if you're looking for a narrative driven experience, obviously you won't find that here. If we're talking about overall visuals, atmosphere, and art style, Tower of Kalemonvo nails it. Each floor has its own unique design and really hits that grim, dark, gothic aesthetic, at the same time putting a unique twist on it with the use of certain color palettes and design choices. It's kind of hard to explain as I'm not an artist myself, but when you look at it, you can tell that yes, it's trying to emulate the Diablo 1 style, but it still has its own thing going on. One small detail I appreciate is that the way the items look reflect how they look on your character model. And while you do have some of the typical dark fantasy enemy designs and types, there are some unique ones thrown in the mix there. All of these visual elements combine to create a palpable increase of tension as each floor changes. Another random detail that I didn't like at first but ended up growing on me is the fact that there's no enemy HP bars. Instead, enemies have an outline that goes from green to red to indicate the general idea of how much HP is left. My only complaint is that the enemy model's attack animation sometimes doesn't match when it actually comes out, so it felt like I would get damaged earlier than I should have been, especially when the particular enemy had a really fast attack animation to begin with. Not really game breaking, but kind of annoying considering how careful you have to be in combat. As far as sound goes, the ambient noises and music are minimalist, but that works in the game's favor. Similar to how the visual design contributes to the increase in tension as you move up the tower, the background music that accompanies each floor ever so slightly increase in tension as you get closer to the top. I'll also say that combat sounds kind of lack significant sound impact, but at the same time I could argue that it's part of the developer's vision. Overall, the visuals and sound design come together to create a charming package full of nostalgia. Some final takeaways, starting with what it does really well, and that is playing into the nostalgia factor, especially for longtime Diablo fans, which I could argue is a negative for some people too. Sort of related to the first point, I would say that the game is also great at maintaining its own identity despite its obvious influence. Considering what the game is setting out to do, the atmosphere and visuals are also some of the more standout features of the entire experience. And lastly, while it seems like kind of a small thing, the ability to save and load your game file at any time is a really nice quality of life feature. There are a couple of things that I'm more on the fence about. First is the classless combat system. It's an idea that I love on paper, but because of the way the leveling up progression in this game works, it's kinda awkward since there's no respec and you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot if you try to go for a hybrid playstyle. I mean really, it's like Tower of Kalemonvo, more like Tower of Terror where the distribution of power is fairer. If you can call it that, better consider all your stats or you're gonna hit a wall in fact and start falling back, or at least starting a new save file, which can be frustrating if it happens more than a few times. Another neutral factor to me is the fact that the game barely explains anything else besides the basics. While it did take me a little bit to get the ball rolling on playing the game, as someone who's a big fan of FromSoft and other Souls-likes, it didn't really bother me in the long run. However, I can see how that can be a problem for other people who get into this game for the first time. As far as for the factors that could use improvement, there are a few. After reaching a certain character level, combat becomes repetitive relatively early on. It doesn't really help that there's a lot of early game friction, especially as it relates to HP and mana recovery. On top of that, loot RNG can be really unforgiving, especially if you don't get any gear that works towards the build that you're trying to build. A couple of other smaller complaints are misleading enemy animations and some weird quality of life choices. So who might this game be for? It's definitely for retro ARPG enthusiasts, slow burn strategists, and Diablo 1 purists. On the flip side, it might not be for players seeking fast-paced combat, deeper story, interesting itemization, or more modern quality of life features, although there is some. It does feel like there's a lot of great future potential and the developer seems really receptive to feedback. Balance patches and minor quality of life tweaks could make the experience that much better. Of course, there's the dichotomy of the developer balancing their vision versus community feedback and the tension that comes with that. Anyway, that's Tower of Kalemonvo. If you crave Diablo 1's grit with a slight modern twist, check it out. If not, maybe wait for future balance patches. And I'd be interested to hear in the comments what retro games you'd want revived with a modern twist. That's it for now, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.